Good afternoon and welcome back. We are now beginning the Session 1 Trade in Goods, Rules of Origin, and Trade Facilitation. The session is now open.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, good evening, or depending where you are, and welcome to this first session of our conference on regional comprehensive economic partnership agreements. We had a rich discussion this morning. I'm not sure if every one of you had the opportunity to join, but we heard about the potential benefits of the agreement of RCEP. We also heard about numerous challenges in implementation of the agreements. And most importantly, the discussions stressed the importance of rules of origin, accumulation, the challenges in implementation on trade facilitation commitments. And this was really highlighted in a number of times by all panelists. So this afternoon, we propose to deep dive in these topics and in this area with 2 lead presenters and 3 distinguished panelists who will help us to shed light on the benefits, but also the complexity and of these areas and what needs to be done. So let me first introduce our first lead speaker, Mr. Jamie Thompson. Jamie Thompson is currently a principal policy analyst in the New Zealand Customs Service trade policy team. His current role is as a negotiator for the customs-related chapter in New Zealand free trade agreements. And most recently, he has been lead negotiators for rules of origin chapter in New Zealand, UK FTA, and the rules of origin and customs procedure chapters in the RCEP agreement and the upgraded of China, New Zealand FTA. He has a long career in customs related areas that I'm unfortunately not able to report all completely today in full, but he has been undertaking a range of different roles, including project managing, the introduction of automated passenger processing into New Zealand airports, co-development and facilitation of leadership development programs for Pacific Island customs agencies, and also as a manager of the National Training Unit, sponsoring the introduction of e-learning into customs training framework. So without further ado, Jamie Thompson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's always nice to get an introduction like that because I realise that the last few years haven't quite been as unproductive as they may otherwise have been. Good evening here from New Zealand. Good afternoon to those in Manila, and a general hello to all others wherever you may be and whatever time it may be. I guess that's one of the things with these virtual seminars is that you never quite know who's where from where and what the time is. I was going to then talk about a brief introduction, but we've just done that. But in regard to my RCEP involvement, I was New Zealand's lead negotiator for the Rules of Origin and Customs chapters from 2014, being involved right up until the signing in 2020. And then I was lucky enough to move on to the implementation in early 2021. And have been involved in that over the last year and a bit. When negotiating the Rules of Origin chapter for RCEP, one of the issues that became increasingly prominent over time was the range of difference between the RCEP parties. On the surface level, when you look at the parties, we had significant variations in the population, geographic and economic size. We had the full range of possible political systems and different development statuses that we had to merge together. And if you tried to assemble probably a more diverse range of countries to work together on a project, you probably couldn't. Now you'll see on the slide there, I have put 16 and then crossed it out and put 15. And that is for much of the development of the Rules of Origin chapter. We did still have India involved, albeit unfortunately they pulled out. But they were a significant player in the much of the development of the Rules of Origin chapter. Sitting below the obvious surface differences between the RCEP parties was also very different in their FTA histories, their domestic processes and their requirements, as the slide notes. A couple of points about this. In regard to FTA histories, some parties had extensive histories in developing FTAs, many cases with each other, and some did not. And for example, New Zealand had more full negotiated comprehensive FTAs with Singapore than some RCEP members had in total. There was also the central combining element of the RCEP membership was the ASEAN +1 FTAs. And although these existed, they didn't provide enough cohesion to provide for pre-established landing zones. But a big factor in influencing the content of the Rules of Origin chapter was the different compliance models that the different parties operated. Some parties operated low documentation, more automated, and in some cases higher trust models, while others placed a greater reliance on the use and submission of physical documents to verify the origin of goods for all claims made. And while all parties did commit to the use of risk management in the customs procedure chapter, the Rules of Origin chapter had to accommodate different levels of risk tolerance that different parties had in place. And just to add one more level of intrigue to the chapter, there was a couple of instances where for domestic purposes, parties sought to have specific provisions included, and they had to be incorporated in there as well, some of which were outside the norm. And bridging all these differences created some significant challenges. The result of all this was through the Rules of Origin chapter had to overcome these challenges and differences, and by default emerging over time was the use of options or alternatives to bring the different parties together on issues so we could actually agree text to land on. And we had to do this without creating contradictions or conflicts within the individual articles themselves and across the overall chapter. The most obvious example of this use of options or alternatives is in the proof of origin provisions. During the negotiation, there was much discussion about the strengths and weaknesses of the different proof of origin options. What would be an agreed starting point there for entry into force? What would be a more challenging outcome that would look like, and how you could move from one to the other? And the outcome we reached was for the agreement to utilize the traditional certificate of origin issued by an authorized issuing body. And that was an essential requirement for some parties. So that was the one that was implemented at entry into force. But along with that was a phased implementation of more modern declaration of origin by approved exporters and the declaration of origin by producers or exporters, which some of the RCEP parties now prefer to use. So this was an example of bringing together the traditional and the modern to meet the needs of all. And referring to the point I made before about the different compliant frameworks for degrees of development, in order to achieve what we thought at the time was the best possible outcome for all, we being the negotiating team, the agreement allows parties to implement the different proofs of origin options over time, allowing time for each party to adapt and adjust its domestic policy settings and processes to meet these new requirements. But the key part is, in the end, all three options will need to be implemented and utilised by all RCEP parties. So the ultimate outcome that we were seeking does get there. And when it comes to implementing an FTA, any FTA, there is the need to understand, explain, and implement the agreed provisions so traders can utilise the agreement and customs authorities can correctly implement the agreement's provisions. In the case of RCEP's origin provisions, there is an extensive set of implementation requirements for the RCEP participating countries, the RPCs, as a collective and for each individual member. And as I said, beginning the chapter negotiations, we thought the use of options provided the best possible outcome. But the best possible outcome significantly compounded the implementation work that needed to be done. And again, looking at the proof of origin, there are different requirements for the certificate of origin, the declaration of origin, and the approved exporter option as shown on the table. So after pausing to take a breath following the official signing of RCEP in late 2020, in 2021, officials from the 15 signatory states continued to work together on the collective tasks, while we also undertook our domestic ratification processes, leading towards entry into force, which at that stage, the target was late 2021, which in the end we met. But again, the diversity of membership impacted on the work we had to do to accommodate the different domestic requirements. For example, some parties needed to authorize the certificate of origin form through their internal processes. So we actually had to develop the form in time for these processes to be undertaken and completed prior to entry into force. So they had to be completed sometime beforehand. And while not all requirements needed to be completed by entry into force, as the approved exporter and declaration of origin provisions can be brought in later, there is a requirement for all parties to do them all sooner or later. One aspect that we spent a lot of time on during 2021 was the implementation of the differentiated tariff schedules. While strictly speaking, not a rules of origin issue, as the tariff differentials article is in the Trade in Goods chapter, development and implementation of the provision fell to the RU folk as identifying the country of origin as an information requirement on the proof of origin document. So if you cannot identify proof of origin, you cannot meet the rules of origin requirement. And like the proof of origin outcome, the country of origin provisions on how to determine the country of origin for a good, there are variations or alternatives. In this case, there are 4 alternatives to determine the country of origin: 1 based on production process, 1 based on value, and 2 default options. And as I note on the slide there, personally, I think implementation of country of origin may be the biggest challenge for both traders and customs authorities to meet in the near future. While I've spoken about the challenges and complexity that the diversity of RCEP's membership brought to the Rules of Origin chapter, the irony is that this diversity of membership is also the greatest strength and attraction of the agreement. The ability to accumulate materials from 15 countries with geographic spread, diverse range of raw materials, technical capability, labor into the production of a good is unprecedented. And as I previously noted, RCEP brings together the traditional and the modern. And this is again demonstrated in the accumulation article, where we have originating goods accumulation at entry into force, built with a built-in review to expand the scope to the more modern approach of full accumulation. A bit of personal reflection from my RCEP experience over the last 8 years. While providing options or alternatives is thought by negotiators to be beneficial for traders, and it does provide a means to resolve issues and work through issues, it creates a significant degree of complexity, and that it is a far greater degree of complexity than I expected. And the key aspect in the complexity of the chapter is ensuring that all the various elements work together, forming a consistent, coherent chapter. So the definitions fit with the proof of origin, that fits with the verification processes, that fits with the product-specific rules, that fits with the forms that are created, and it is one coherent stream that works together. And then the implementation of the FTA becomes a bigger and more complex piece of work with all this complexity. And as I work for New Zealand Customs, I will make a special note of the various customs agencies. We all have a lot of work to do to prepare. We all had a lot of work to do to prepare for entry into force, and this work continues as we have to adopt the new provisions over time. So I guess a final thought. As a rules of origin negotiator, it took a lot of work over a long period of time, visiting a large number of countries, all of which I loved and enjoyed, to negotiate and implement the agreement. And there's still work to be done, but we have got the world's biggest FTA into force and operating. And I think that is a significant achievement. And now we hope that the vision that the negotiators had can be utilized by producers, exporters, and importers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for this excellent presentation. I think we all heard about the paradox, right? The most promising area for potential benefits, but also the most complex one to implement. Let me move to our next speaker, who will complement this analysis. Our next lead speaker is Mr. Stefano Nama. He's Chief of Technical Assistance and Trade and Customs in the Division of Africa and Least Developed Countries in UNCTAD. And he possesses over 30 years of experience on trade and customs issue, matured advising governments and private sector. He has designed and managed research and trade-related capacity building programs in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and with a focus on trade laws and policy, regulatory and institutional trade issues with specialization on rules of origin and market access. And in fact, he has been writing extensively on these areas, and he's the author of the most comprehensive analytical book on rules of origin, which is Rules of Origin in International Trade, with a second forthcoming editions very soon in Cambridge University Press. He has also been representing UNCTAD during the negotiations in the Technical Committee on Rules of Origin established at the World Customs Organization, and most recently at Working Group on the revision of the Annex K of the Kyoto Convention. So, Mr. Nama, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen. I may start, and I thank Jamie for his presentation, which is covering and corroborating some of the findings of our research that we did with Asian Development Bank. And what I'm going to say is basically drawing from a brief and a technical paper on rules of origin that has been carried out. I think that the scope of the analysis that I'm going to show this morning is that RCEP is widely expected to act as unifying factor, especially on trading goods, in the sense that we have one single agreement with one single set of rules of origin that is expected to address the panoply of existing rules of origin in the Asian and Pacific region. However, it has to be said at the same time that RCEP does not supersede the existing FTAs such as ATIGA and ASEAN +1 FTAs. Then the questions comes quite obvious in the sense, if other agreements still coexist with RCEP, what is the incremental value of RCEP? Will RCEP will bring value added over and above the existing agreements? Well, there are different point of view on this, since in the literature we have seen that some of the commentators are saying that RCEP does not provide a strong discipline on some areas, and it is being qualified as a shallow agreement. So the scope of our analysis was to dip a little bit on this kind of contradictory statement. Some of it, they welcome RCEP as a problem solver, and some others that are commenting that RCEP is a shallow agreement. And how did we do that? We're doing this in the research that has been carried out by analyzing the textual content of the trading goods chapters, comparing the RCEP commitment contained in the trading goods chapters with WTO commitment and with ATIGA or CPTPP commitment, because these there are other existing and overlapping agreements in the region, and then identify the shallow or deep nature of the commitment and provide policy recommendation for the RCEP built-in agenda. Since, as we are seeing today, RCEP is an ASEAN way agreement, is an evolving agreement which contains a rich built-in agenda. Now, when we look at the RCEP chapter on trading goods, we carried out a preliminary assessment on some of the chapters like SPS, trade remedies, customs procedure, and trade facilitation. And we have seen that the shallow nature, in these chapters, which are important chapters, because we know that in the Asian region, there are many non-tariff measures that are applying, and the SPS and TBT chapters, there are chapters, which were meant to solve some of these NTMs. However, when we look into the commitment that have been taken in RCEP in the context of SPS and TBT, we have not found any WTO plus commitment. And the same can be held on the trade facilitation and customs procedures. In these areas as well, the RCEP is not going further. Does not provide any WTO plus procedures or commitment, or if there are, they are quite limited. Now, then the big question turns to the classical elements of a free trade area agreement, which are tariff and rules of origin. Can we observe there some quick wins? I mean, what is the incremental value of RCEP on these areas? And there, I mean, and then we turn into the firm's perspective, in the sense that why the firms are using or should be using RCEP over and above the existing FTAs. And firms, I mean, are there, I mean, for profit, and they will use RCEP over and above the existing agreements only if they have a duty saving, if they have a profit for them. And the profit for them is basically tariff reduction schedules that are better under RCEP than under other existing agreement, and rules of origin that are easier to comply with. Rules of origin that are more trade facilitating than those already existing in the FTAs. And all these elements are determinant for an effective utilization of RCEP, and that is the question for the present and the near future. Now, I'm giving now an example of what, I mean, could be the advantage of RCEP over and above the status quo. We have here an example of a producer of laser, which is established in Korea and is manufacturing these lasers using part of laser from Japan. And when he's importing this part of laser of Japan, is paying MFN rate of duty because there is no FTA between Japan and South Korea. And at the same time, when South Korea is exporting to China, well, there is a free trade area agreement. So the MFN rate is 6%, but it will pay less duties of 2.4% if the rules of origin are complied with. Now, with RCEP, this value chain will be completely liberalized in the sense that no duties will be paid if there is compliance with rules of origin. And on top, the Korean manufacturer will, thanks to accumulation, will be allowed to consider the part of lasers made in Japan as originating in Korea, and therefore the rules of origin will be easier to comply with. However, there is an if, in the sense that we are talking and we are assuming into this rosy scenario full implementation of our RCEP commitment and compliance with rules of origin. So, I mean, as I was saying, I mean, I'm sorry about this interruption. What is the architecture of a tariff offer? In the sense that I think that Jamie has pointed out that, I mean, about the complexities of a tariff offer, I mean, in RCEP. And one of the complexity is given by the fact that there are 38 different tariff schedules in RCEP. And the architecture of these tariff schedules are quite different to read, since at times we have differentiated offers, in the sense that some members like China, Indonesia, Republic of Korea, Philippines, and Vietnam, they have chosen to have differentiated offers among the RCEP member, and this has caused the complication that Jamie mentioned of the tariff differentials. And then, I mean, we will come later with an example about this. Now, the tariff offers is also complex in the sense that the tariff phase out of RCEP will take place in a long period of time. We see here that it starts from entry to force, but then in order to achieve the implementation of the tariff offer and the tariff liberalization in RCEP will take up to 20 years. And only after 20 years, we will have a progressive liberalization till 89% of inter-RCEP trade that will be duty-free. So it will take quite a long time in order to see the full implementation of RCEP. Now, I mean, let's go, I mean, to the rules of origin. I think, I mean, that much has already been said. The result of what of the negotiations on rules of origin is that it's true that provide a single set of rules of origin. There is an expansion of the scope for accumulation in the sense that we have a big producer of intermediate products like China that is entering into the picture, which is facilitating compliance with rules of origin with the regional value content. However, there are also a series of shortcomings that has to be addressed. There is a scarce predictability in the sense that Jamie has pointed out that it was difficult to agree on certain provisions like a proof of origin, and this has meant that certain provisions they do have a scarce predictability, and there is nothing more that the business and firms hate that the scarce predictability, because they are investing in production and they want to be sure, I mean, that a duty-free or reduced rate of duty will be applied at the time of custom entry. And there is also the provision accumulation. Till now, I mean, we are discussing about accumulation of materials, but we are not discussing about what is called the fuel accumulation, which is accumulation of working or processing. I think that the issue of proof of origin and the diversity of rules of origin, of the proof of origin system that are adopted in RCEP has been already illustrated by Jamie. But obviously for firms, I mean, to cope, I mean, with this diversity of system, and also for customs to implement the diversity of system of proof of origin is a real challenge during implementation. And last but not least, the issue of tariff differentials. The issue of tariff differential is a real complication. And here we have an example in the sense that we have in Vietnam, we have a very high MFN rate of duty on cars. And therefore, I mean, we have an investor which planned to invest for car manufacturing in Cambodia, since in Cambodia as duty-free access, I mean, to Vietnam thanks to ATIGA. However, if you're utilizing ATIGA and is importing parts from Japan, it will have to comply with a regional value content of 40%. Which may be difficult to comply since all the parts like gears and other parts of the cars will be imported from Japan into Cambodia, and then in Cambodia the car will be assembled for export to Vietnam. So for, I mean, since, I mean, all the materials coming from Japan will be considered as non-regional value material, therefore it will be difficult for the Japanese manufacturer to comply with rules of origin in Cambodia. Now, he may use now RCEP, because in RCEP, what is the advantage of RCEP? RCEP is going to progressively liberalize the duties when the car is exported to Vietnam, and on top, he may consider, thanks to accumulation, all the materials imported from Japan as Cambodian material. And therefore, I mean, it will be much easier to comply with the regional value content of 40% for exporting the car to Vietnam. However, there is the issue of tariff differential. Because if you look into the tariff schedule of Vietnam, it provides, I mean, that the tariff concession to Cambodia will only be applied if there is a value added of 20% in Cambodia. And this is the criteria for adopting the RCEP rate of duty tariff differential towards Cambodia. And 20% value added in Cambodia has to be achieved by labor cost and local material in Cambodia to manufacture the car, which is quite difficult to comply with since there are no supporting industries existing in Cambodia to provide parts of car. So in the end, the question is this commercially viable? And that's, I mean, is one of the issues about the application of tariff differential and the application of accumulation within RCEP, which is expected to be one of the big advantages of RCEP. Now, we did also another analysis of RCEP rules of origin, where we compared the rules of origin or RCEP with the product-specific rules of origin or RCEP with those of ATIGA and CPTPP. And basically, the analysis that was being carried out was to detect there was are the rules of origin in RCEP more lenient or more stringent than was contained under ATIGA and CPTPP. And basically, we did an analysis line by line, and this involved an analysis of 15,000 or more product-specific rules of origin to see if the product-specific rules of origin contained in these agreements were more lenient, less lenient, or they were the same. In this specific case that we are showing now, for live animals, the requirement is wholly obtained in RCEP, meaning that the live animals have to be born and raised in RCEP, which is identical to the specific requirement under ATIGA, wholly obtained, born and raised in ATIGA countries. The rules of origin in CPTPP looks different because it requires a change of tariff classification, but in the end, the requirement is the same, in the sense that, I mean, also, even if it's written and drafted in a different manner, the requirement is that live animals have to be born and raised in a CPTPP countries. So in big example, there is not only the rules of origin are the same, but they are almost identical in the requirement. So the result of this analysis shows that basically there is no evidence that RCEP product-specific rules of origin are more liberal than other agreements. We see here that ATIGA ranks at the best with the least restrictive product-specific rules of origin, with 3,321 product-specific rules of origin that are more liberal than those contained in RCEP and CPTPP. But what is most important that we found out in this analysis is that there might be convergence in the sense where rules of origin are identical across the three agreements, or the rules of origin are partially convergent. They are the same or similar in two agreements, with one agreement slightly different. And we counted that this convergence, which means facilitation, because we will have the same rules of origin, product-specific rules of origin applicable across the three agreements, we counted around 3,109 subheadings, which is a significant number. By concluding, obviously, when you look at the trading goods chapters of RCEP, there are some chapters, I mean, like TPT and SPS, which could be improved. And the question is that can RCEP further liberalize using the ASEAN way the commitments contained in these SPS, TPT, trade facilitation chapters, which are very important for the functioning of RCEP. That's the question mark, I mean, that the negotiators and the implementers have in front of them. In the issues of the tariffs, there is a built-in agenda. There are built-in agenda mechanisms and provisions for liberalizing tariffs, resume negotiation to further liberalize tariffs under Article 2.5, acceleration of tariff commitment, and under Article 221 for sectorial initiative to achieve greater and faster tariff liberalization. While our rules of origin, there is also a built-in agenda. The first one would be to simplify the proof of origin and moving towards a self-certification. This is, as Jamie pointed out, is already in, but possibly need to be fast-tracked and simplified. Finalize the text on accumulation and other related provision. And also there is the case for establishing a working group to achieve convergence on product-specific rules of origin, since the agreements, they are showing, I mean, a convergence on these product-specific rules of origin, but it can be leveraged. By concluding, obviously, when you look at the trading goods chapters of RCEP, there are some chapters, I mean, like TPT and SPS, which could be improved. And the question is that can RCEP further liberalize using the ASEAN way the commitments contained in these SPS, TPT, trade facilitation chapters, which are very important for the functioning of RCEP. That's the question mark, I mean, that the negotiators and the implementers have in front of them. in the issues of the tariffs, there is a built-in agenda. There are built-in agenda mechanisms and provisions for liberalizing tariffs, resume negotiation to further liberalize tariffs under Article 2.5, acceleration of tariff commitment, and Article 221 for sectorial initiative to achieve greater and faster tariff liberalization. While on rules of origin, there is also a built-in agenda. The first one would be to simplify the proof of origin and moving towards a self-certification. This is, as Jamie pointed out, is already in, but possibly need to be fast-tracked and simplified. Finalize the text on accumulation and other related provision. And also there is the case for establishing a working group to achieve convergence on product-specific rules of origin, since the agreements, they are showing, I mean, a convergence on these product-specific rules of origin, but it can be leveraged on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for this presentation. I think it was quite extensive on trading goods, the challenges also with no absence of WTO plus provision in SPS, and then the long tariff phasing down. And I think it was a nice complement to the presentation by Jamie. I think now is the time to introduce our distinguished panelists who will provide us new insight on this area. So the first panelist is Professor Tam Siu Yin. She's a visiting professor, visiting senior fellow at ISIA's Yusof Ishak Institute and professor emeritus at the University of Kebangsaan, Malaysia. He was formerly director and professor of international trade at the Institute of Malaysian and International Studies at the same university, and her research interests cover trade in goods and services as well as foreign direct investments. And she has a PhD in economics from University of Rochester, USA. So, Professor, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chair, for kind words of introduction. A very good afternoon and good evening to all. Thank you for the opportunity here to share some of my thoughts on the RCEP in Malaysia. The RCEP was ratified for Malaysia in January and entered into force on 18th March. It is expected to increase the exports from the tariff cuts in the RCEP, according to the UNCTAD study, that Malaysia and Singapore are expected to be the largest beneficiaries from the RCEP tariff concessions, and the exports from Malaysia are projected to increase due to these tariff cuts. As you know, exports are very important for Malaysia. Malaysia is a trading country, and the exports to GDP in 2020 amounts to more than 60%. So this projected increase in exports is expected to benefit Malaysia. Malaysia also expects or hopes to have more investments from the RCEP and non-RCEP countries, using Malaysia to expand the trade ties to the region and to enable Malaysia to move up global value chains. So there are expected benefits. However, there are also great challenges. As in the case, I think, of other ASEAN countries, the record of the utilization of FTAs is actually quite low, and keeping track on the utilization may not be obvious, in the sense that the ministry has the certificates of origin, but these are not public goods. They're kept within the ministry, and it is uncertain whether this information is collected and analyzed in order to understand better the firms who are able to utilize the FTAs. So keeping track of utilization of the previous FTAs is not so clear that it has been done. Also, in the case of Malaysia, as in other developing countries, micro, small and medium enterprises are the dominant types of firms in the country. And you can see that more than 90% of the enterprises are actually in this category. And the common problem that has been discussed earlier is also found in the case of Malaysia, which is essentially to get the SMEs to utilize the agreement. Apart from the compliance costs, I think the other common problems which have been identified are actually lack of awareness. The enterprises may not know or understand what RCEP is about and may not have the knowledge on how to meet the requirements. This is because most of the SMEs are actually maybe owner managed, and they don't have the human resources to expand, to study the agreement and how to use it, while the owners are usually very busy with the daily running of the operations. So that's a common problem that I think it's experienced in most countries and also in Malaysia. And as we have heard in the earlier, from the earlier speakers, the tariffs are actually quite difficult to understand, and you need to check by product, by country, and there's a span of 20 years for the tariffs to fall. So in the case of Malaysia, on the right side, as you can see, the ministry has actually put up the whole agreement, including all the schedules of commitments on the website. So the information is out there. Whether the SMEs are able to utilize this information and to search out the tariffs is a different matter, because it's actually not easy to read the tariff schedule. For example, this is what China has offered to ASEAN, and China is an important trading partner. So in order to read the tariff schedule, you need to know your HS code, you need to know the base year, and you need to compare the tariff reduction. It is not such a simple matter to do that. And this is just for the case of China. So, and we have also heard mentioned many times this morning and by the two earlier speakers that accessing the rules of origin is a technical matter, not something that the firms may know. So firms actually need technical help. So what has actually Malaysia done? It has actually improved. I think the ministry is reaching out, and it has organized regular talks, they call it the bucket talk, on the introduction to FTAs, how to use the preferential certificates of origin. So it's scheduled throughout the year that we have these outreach programs, and not just by the ministry, but the chambers of commerce, such as the Association of Chinese Chambers of Commerce, have also come up with their own plan to reach out to their members to explain to them RCEP and how to use RCEP to expand the business opportunity. So they are increasing outreach. But all these assume that the SMEs have the capacity to export, and they are planning to export or increase their export volumes. In actual fact, the exports of SMEs are very small in Malaysia. The SMEs contribute to less than 10% of manufacturing exports. So those which are exporting are actually the minority. The main exports come from the multinationals. So if we look at what is happening in ASEAN and what the survey that has been conducted by the ASEAN Secretariat, what is happening in Malaysia is not peculiar to Malaysia, because it says that only 19% of the companies surveyed in the region are exporting. So if the firms are not exporting, even if you have the opportunities, if you have scheduled talks, what the problem is that it doesn't bring the SMEs to the talks, because they would say it is not of importance to us since we are not exporting. So even if you have all these greater dissemination efforts, you cannot bring the SMEs on board unless you have additional efforts to enhance SMEs exports in the first place before they can access the RCEP opportunities. How do we enable SMEs to export? And the survey also says that SMEs are actually not internationalizing the activities because they have insufficient international knowledge. In actual fact, when I talk to them, they actually say they don't know how to export. They don't know how to they don't know how to meet the import requirements of the export destinations. And for existing SMEs exporters, would they want to consider expanding to new markets in the RCEP member countries since they are already exporting? Would they be able to utilize the RCEP to export to new markets? Actually, the survey says that maybe not so easy because they may not be able to find a trade partner. So the challenges are just beyond the technical requirements. Is actually back to first step. How do you get the SMEs to export? So therefore, if we want to get firms on board the RCEP, I agree we need to improve utilization, we need to improve dissemination, we need to have technical support, we need to explain to them. But it is only relevant to them if the SMEs have an eye on the international market, if they have plans to internationalize the operations, if they want to use the agreement to start exporting, for example, if they haven't exported yet. So we need actually complementary programs to support SMEs, to nurture new exports, and to enable existing exporters to diversify to new markets. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. It was a very interesting presentation on the challenges faced by exporters. And yeah, I think you made it very clear that yeah, we can look at utilization and challenges to export and to use RCEP, but we need in the first place, you know, MSMEs and firms to be willing to export and to have the capacity beyond technical requirements to export in the destination markets. So it was very insightful. Thank you very much. Let me now introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker, panelist, is Hick. He is Fonterra Cooperative Group Customs Manager, providing specialist customs advice to Fonterra's manufacturing and trading activities, business methodologies, and strategic direction. This involves regular interactions with border agencies on good clearance matters, secure supply chains, post-entry audits, disclosure and appeal, and implementation of trade agreements and market access. And Hick also represents Fonterra at the World Customs Organization's private sector consultative group, and he is currently providing private sector input on rules of origin to the WTO, to the World Customs Organization review of the revised Kyoto Convention. So, Kit, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, Pamela, and nice to meet you. And many thanks to you and the Asian Development Bank for the invitation to participate in this conference and for the opportunity to contribute to it. There's been quite a lot written about the RCEP, and there's been quite a lot said today about the RCEP. Including that it will provide an overarching mechanism for regional trade with the benefit of a single set of rules and procedures for accessing preferential tariffs across the region. Well, this sounds pretty good from a policy perspective, but in a region awash with more ambitious trade deals which offer more opportunity in the RCEP, it's unlikely to achieve its goals. RCEP may be comprehensive, but like all such agreements, it is at heart a trade and goods agreement. This is evidenced by the media and political coverage invariably focus on increased market access for goods. In this context, the important things to know are market access, what's in it for me, rules of origin, how do my goods qualify, and a subset of the rules of origin, the operational certification procedures, what paperwork do I need? Market access and rules of origin are closely associated and complementary in terms of function, that is, protecting the party's defensive interests. Market access does this by way of absolute numbers, extended or partial tariff elimination, exclusions, quantitative restrictions, and quotas. The rules of origin do this by making it harder for your trading partner's goods to become originating. While market access and the rules of origin set the ambition for the agreement, they do not determine its success. It's the operational certification procedures that will make or break the RCEP, because this is where customs and trade engage and preferential access is accepted or denied. In this regard, the RCEP breaks no ground. RCEP won't lack for success. There are opportunities, especially in cases where two of the parties don't have an existing trade agreement, but it does not mean that the measure of success, well, it does mean that the measure of success is comparatively low compared to agreements with fewer parties. Opportunities, however limited, are always welcome and worth pursuing. So you would think, but this is often not the case. Experience with other agreements tells us that if the certification procedures are interpreted, implemented, and enforced differently by different customs agencies, the resultant uncertainty and risk will make any improved market access less attractive. RCEP is competing with agreements across the region that not only offer better market access opportunities, they also offer business-friendly certification processes that reflect the modern trading environment and customs risk assessment environment. Many of these agreements include the RCEP parties. In terms of alignment, that is, the overarching mechanism and a single set of rules, RCEP is a lost opportunity. RCEP certification procedures, rather than providing a single clear process, offers options with varied timelines extending out to 10 to 20 years. Considering all the RCEP parties are signatory to the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, all have to one degree or another invested in IT customs systems, and during COVID evidenced a capability to manage electronic documents. It's quite amazing that the certification timeline agreed doesn't specify an electronic ambition. Thankfully, the RCEP negotiators agreed to a prescribed format for the certificate of origin for those that use them. This is an improvement over the CPTPP, as it negates the possibility of each party prescribing their own. Due to the impact of these procedures have on trade agreements, I've often wondered why an MFN type clause doesn't exist, whereby if any of the negotiating parties accepts electronic documents, even simple PDFs or declarations on trade documents in any other agreement or for normal trade, they cannot agree to otherwise in the agreement under negotiation. It would certainly help with the original alignment of the rules. Another well-known problem is direct consignment, and RCEP makes no progress with this. RCEP identifies certificates of non-manipulation, invoices, and transport documents as examples of appropriate documentation. They are not. Certificates of non-manipulation are not always available, and not all transit countries issue them, in which case an alternative route to market must be found, which adds complexity to the supply chain as well as increasing costs and risk for traders. Invoices tend to show only the export shipping details. In instances of third-party invoicing, exporters, importers, or sellers are not likely to be aware of the shipping details other than the export departure and the import arrival. Shipping routes are increasingly fluid, as we all know, if you shop on Amazon at the moment, and vessels redirected en route, goods transshipped, etc., without the knowledge of the exporter or importer, and as a result, invoices are unlikely to reflect the transport. Transport documents, especially through bills of lading, are increasingly seen by customs as a useful tool for origin verification, with the expectation that all transit ports will be shown. This is generally not the case, and the lack of voyage data, at least in the eyes of customs, negates the use of the transport document for this purpose. So why is it mentioned as an appropriate document? To be fair, the RCEP uses words like may and such as, but without doubt, some customs will implement regulations, rules, or practice that effectively mandate these documents. There is also the question of reasonableness and appropriateness of using documents issued by people who have no obligation or accountability under the agreement, who are also outside the control of the exporter, the importer, and for this purpose, both the exporting and importing customs. Origin verifications really question the originating status of the goods. My experience is that 90+% of verifications are focused solely on the paperwork, from the color of the ink, the position of the stamp, the formatting of the paper, the legibility of the signature, etc. This makes the certification extremely important in terms of RCEP utilization. And for those that may have mentioned that the rules of origin are difficult to understand and comply with. This is the cynic in me coming out. You don't need to know the rules of origin. If your paperwork's squared away, you're probably okay. Business is grateful for the benefits that trade agreements make possible. However, all trade agreements, including the RCEP, add complexity to the trading environment. Manufacturers, certification issuing bodies, exporters and importers not only require knowledge of the rules and procedures, but they must also have confidence in the processes to balance the available preferences with the administrative burden and risk to access them. RCEP offers limited market access advantages over existing agreements, but if the certification rules were more progressive and applied consistently, it may have outweighed some of RCEP's tariff disadvantages. Although the RCEP is a new agreement, most of the parties are old friends and know each other very well. Much of the text follows a standard formula, meaning the standard set of problems will arise, and it is hoped implementers will use the established lines of communication to engage each other to constructively align interpretive differences and smooth any bumps along the way. Is RCEP a new paradigm? I don't think so, at least not for trade and goods. And just picking up on Jamie's comments, Jamie's absolutely right. It's very challenging to manage the ambitions of so many parties. It's an impossible job. And unfortunately, unless the larger parties exercise their clout, the tail ends up wagging the dog. Thank you very much. I appreciate the chance.
Thank you very much, Kate, for this comment on RCEP. I think you made something very clear, that the success of an agreement is not measured by the number of parties, because the number of parties may in fact increase its complexity, and that as we can see here in the trading goods scenario, that just the fact that the certification process is so complex and actually not as modern as other methods offered in other competing FTAs, this will be a major issue for the private sector to use the agreement. So thank you very much. We heard your message very, very well. Now, let me turn to our last panelist, who is also gonna, raise the voice from the private sector. As we already discussed also in the opening, the objective is to make RCEP useful, and to hear about all these challenges and find ways to address them. So our last speaker is Wong Meng Yu. He is a partner in the Deloitte Singapore office, and he is the leader of the global trade advisory practice in Southeast Asia. He regularly advises clients in navigating investments into CA from a market access perspective, involving movement of goods, services, and investment. And such advice includes cross-border supply chain strategies from a legal, regulatory, tax, and trade perspective. And prior joining Deloitte, Meng Yu practiced law for more than a decade, serving as partner at an international law firm, advising on trade and customs matters at export controls and sanction compliance. So without further ado, Meng Yu, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Pamela. And just give me a second whilst I try to put this up into full screen. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate, and also to share, some of the work and experience working together with companies in the comparing the RCEP benefits against the existing FTAs from a tariff reduction, a rule of origin, and also the operational certification procedure perspective. We do quite a bit of these types of planning work, both for multinationals and also for SMEs. Here in Singapore and also in the region. I think a lot has been said about the complexities of the rules of origin by Mr. Stefano, and I think Professor Tam also mentioned that it is normally the SMEs, who typically find it harder to utilize the agreements because of the complex provisions and also all of the different FTAs. Here in Singapore, I think I mentioned it during a previous session that Enterprise Singapore does provide grants for SMEs to reach out to advisors such as ourselves to help in terms of navigating the FTAs, and we have actually helped or consulted quite a few SMEs in the last year or so that the grant has been provided. So in this, in the interest of time, I have just provided two case studies. This one concerns an electrical appliance company. It's a European company with production points in Southeast Asia, where the factories are either third parties or wholly owned. They are in Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, and in Singapore. And the invoicing happens via a Singapore entity, and the buyer markets are in Korea, China, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia. So the first thing that we did was we looked at the available FTAs. So one was Artiga, where all of the supply points or the supply countries were a part of. And the second was RCEP. The third was the CPTPP, where only the Philippines was not a party. And we also looked at the UK bilaterals and also the EU agreements, as there was a plan to in addition to the primary Asia Pacific import markets, they were also looking at resupplying the goods back into the EU and also the UK. And here, we found that there were only two jurisdictions, i.e. Singapore and Vietnam, which had agreements all across the 5 countries. So the goods in question were vacuum cleaners and fans under HS codes 8508 and 8414. And we looked at the MFN rates where these were still quite substantial, and also the duty reduction rates under Artiga, RCEP, and also the CPTPP. And I think as Mr. Stefano has, and also the other speakers have mentioned that Artiga, vis-a-vis trade in goods amongst the Artiga countries, have a far superior rate, and therefore in terms of duty savings, it is already zero. Whereas under RCEP, the duty reduction timing is much longer. However, in this particular case, for China and for Korea, we can see that for RCEP, it is also day one. There is a 0% rate. For vacuum cleaners and for fans, there's a slight reduction in 0.5% in the case of Korea. So I think, so the next thing that we also considered, in the being able to utilize the FTAs are also all of the different provisions. So the rules of origin, which are largely similar. RBC 40%, change in tariff heading or subheading, and of course CPTPP has a slightly different one, which is RBC not less than 30% if the build-up method is used, and not less than 40% if build-down method is used. And of course, in most of these more complex supply chains, third country invoicing is also an important provision, given that the invoicing party is not necessarily always the supplying or the exporting party. We also looked at the accumulation ability, and yes, that is available throughout the 5 available FTAs. and the de minimis rule of 10%, that if the originating goods value is less than 10% of the FOB value, that is also available across all 5. And the other one was also the CO requirement, and I think this also goes to Mr. Hickey's point, and I think the other speakers have also raised this, that there are all sorts of formats for COs. Some are still physical rather than electronic, and I think there was also mentioned that the timeline for the full move to a full declaration of origin or self-certification was 10 years under RCEP, and actually 20 years for some of the LDCs. So I think all these adds to the complexities, for people, for companies when they are utilizing the FTAs in selecting them and subsequently using them, to benefit from them. The second case study that I just wanted to share was involving a producer and an exporter in Malaysia. And this time, instead of just re-invoicing out of Singapore, this involves physical warehousing in Singapore. And I think whenever we have a third country that is physically warehousing goods, back-to-back certificates, sometimes with third country invoicing, I think these are all issues that the current FTAs have, whether it's ATIGA, whether it's the ASEAN +1 FTAs, which will also be replicated under RCEP. And the other one is also on the use of free trade zones and bonded areas, given that that requirement under the ASEAN China and the ASEAN India agreement has also been replicated in RCEP. So this example, we looked at 6 or 7 important countries: China, Australia, Japan, India, Korea, and ASEAN. These products were chemical products, so petrochem, mainly polymers, and across a couple of HS codes, mainly in Chapter 39. So we compared, for each supply from Malaysia to all of the different countries. We looked at the MFN rate, the ASEAN +1 rates, and also the bilaterals, and also the preferential rates under RCEP. And I think the same observation here can also be drawn, that there are day one reductions. There are HS codes which are unbound, and there are HS codes where the duty reduction is over a longer period. So similarly, same across Australia, where there is also a bilateral between Malaysia, Australia, there's the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA, and now the RCEP, Korea, India, so on and so forth. In the interest of time, I will just re-summarize that in all of these, duty planning and OCP, rules planning, it always takes quite a bit of time and the efforts, firstly from conceptualizing, and then all the way to practical applications. Do take time, and we anticipate that as time goes by, that there will be practical challenges, which we can also share more of at a later session. Thank you very much, and back to you, Pamela.
Thank you very much, Minju, for this presentation and for sharing the work conducted by Deloitte to support the clients and the different companies in using different trade agreements. It shows, what are basically the main criterion for firms to, when you have a panoply of agreements to use, what you look at, how do you compare the different tariff schedules. And I think that was quite interesting to see. And also it gives us an idea of maybe the work ahead with RCEP, right? Because in RCEP, we will need some sort of similar analysis to support the private sector in understanding the agreement, understanding its value added. And I think the EDB report we're launching today is the first step. We'll have already looked at a little bit about the tariff schedules, but further work will be needed for comparing with other agreements. So now it's time for me to open, well, not to open the floor for questions, but I want to ask you some questions, one question, and then I will open the floor because there are already quite a lot of questions in the chat box, and I think they are quite interesting. So maybe we can just, in fact, start with those questions. I hope the panelists do all have access to those questions, but I'm going to read them as well. So one question here we have in the chat is the approved exporter centrally approved by all RCEP members of its, or it is done domestically? And if it is done domestically, which organ of government or private sector body gives the approval? And what are the required criteria that should be met by the approved exporter? So here, yeah, that's an interesting question. Basically, it's about the authority who is basically going to approve the exporter. I don't know. Maybe I think Jamie, if you have an idea or insights to answer that question. In RCEP, how is it planned or to be,
I guess this is probably not the time to try and deny that I was one of the negotiators. So yes, I do know the answer to this question. It's each party. There are some general criteria contained in the text of the agreement, but respecting the sovereignty of each party, and once again the diversity. I keep going back to that word, our diversity. Each party is free to accredit its own individual exporters and to establish within its own jurisdiction who will do that work. So, for example, in New Zealand, that work is going to be undertaken by the New Zealand Customs Service, and we will determine who will be approved exporters. But it is free for, as I say, each party will make that determination for themselves.
Thank you very much. I hope this answered the question. There is also a question that I partially answered, but I want to raise here in the discussion. We have a question under the release to the African Continental Free Trade Area agreements that has different levels of value of non-originating materials for different kinds of products. And the key reason for this is to ensure flexibility, taking into account the differentiations of developments and liberalization within the specific sectors. And it would be helpful to hear what RCEP is doing in relation to different criteria requirements and rules of origin, namely the value addition, the wholly obtained, and the change of tariff heading, and the value of non-originating materials. So here I would like to ask these questions to Stefano, please. As you also have been negotiating the African Continental Free Trade Area, you may provide insights here on the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've been assisting to the negotiation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And it is true, that one question, this question relates, to the product-specific rules of origin, 5,000 rules of origin that are product-specific contained in RCEP. And one question that I always thought, looking at these product-specific rules, is the regional value content is always 40%, but obviously there should be some variation about the regional value content, because depending on the sectors, regional value content of 40% may be really demanding on some sectors and less demanding in other sectors. So it seems at times that these percentages are applied by random, or are applied, by, I'm not sure, how much they are well thought. And this is an area where further research, should be conducted to see how these kind of percentages and how these product-specific rules of origin are matching the manufacturing capacity of RCEP members, especially the LDCs. Because one issue is that has to be noted that in the case of RCEP, there is no criteria, there is no rules of origin for ASEAN LDCs or other LDCs, in the sense that it is one size fits all. And while we have different economies that are involved and with different levels of development and different level of production capacity, of course, the accumulation is going to be a kind of facilitation that would help, but we are seeing also the accumulation is not a panacea because it comes, with a lot of strings attached. And therefore, there could be, as we argued in the publication, revisiting the product-specific rules of origin to make it more convergent. In the sense that we have seen already that some specific rules of origin they are similar across the agreements. So why don't we have one product-specific rules of origin adopted across various agreements? That will be a great facilitation for companies and also for Deloitte, that is kind of providing such advice to companies. If we have one product-specific rules of origin across the different agreements, it would be a kind of trade facilitating device, and also at the same time to make sure, that the product-specific rules of origin are reflecting the manufacturing capacities and they are liberal enough to create the value chains that RCEP is designed to promote. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe let me turn to Kit for a question. As your presentation focused mostly on, not only, but talked about proof of origin, I would like to ask a simple question, or simple, is what would you suggest as best practice on proof of origin? Because we discuss a lot about proof of origin, and I think there is a lot of discussions also about e-certificates of origins, paperless trading. But overall, I know that in RCEP we have not adopted those modern practices, but thinking ahead, what would you recommend as really best practices in the area?
Firstly, what we have got in one form or another is just baggage. It's legacy baggage that's been around a while, and people can't get out of that mindset. The ultimate proof, and that's when I worked for New Zealand Customs alongside Jamie, was we used to say, prove it or lose it. So you don't need a document, you don't need a declaration, you don't need a certificate, because every time you enter a goods for importation into any country, you submit a customs import entry. That is a declaration. If there's a free trade agreement, there will almost certainly be a drop-down box to pick the FTA you want to use. And once you've ticked that box and your duty liability is reduced because of it, you are then really on the hook with customs. You better be right in what you're saying. There is no better proof than the import declaration itself. Everything else, certificates are not proof of origin. Mostly they're issued by third-party people who don't know the goods. They do it for money. And their business is issuing certificates of origin. The more that they issue, the more money they get. So I would never trust that as proof myself. So the import declaration itself is the key. Cheers.
Okay, I think we hear you. It is we hear you all. Thank you very much for this very straightforward and honest answer. Now I have a so maybe a question to Menu. I think you showed us what you've been doing for your customers and comparing the different agreements. And in more practical aspects, how much of this type of request do you have specifically on RCEP? Because RCEP just entered into force. So I was wondering, to which extent now Deloitte is busy with with supporting private sector specifically on RCEP issues, because we've seen from your presentation that it involves not only RCEP but various FTAs. And what is your sentiments? How do you perceive that the companies you're helping understand? And another question related is, I believe the companies you're helping or supporting are, if you could tell us, I imagine they are mostly multinationals or large companies. And the reason why I'm asking is that the analysis you've been showing to us is quite complex and important. And do you believe that maybe other institutions like ADB or others, we should maybe work and try to also conduct this analysis in a more general way to support also MSMEs, as it was mentioned by Professor Tam, that it's also a big challenges for them. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Pamela. I think on your first question as to are there or have there been more queries coming in these days? I think the answer is yes. I think also to Mr. Stefano's point, about the RBC 40% rule being quite standard and not that could be better segregated to the different industries. One sector that we have also received quite a few queries on is in the chemicals and also the oil and gas refining sector, where the chemical reaction rule that has been replicated under the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA has been put in and has been seen as beneficial, given that there are day one benefits going to some of the North Asia countries. So we are still in the process of looking into that rule, and I think the text is a little bit skinny, or in terms of what that definition is. I'm sure either Jamie or Kit would probably be able to speak more to this. However, given that the import markets are China, Korea, countries that are, I think, implementing it for the first time, perhaps there could be different interpretations of how that rule is applied. On the second point, I think on the is there anything more that can be done? I think seminars like this are really very useful. I've enjoyed all of the presentations from all of the speakers, and I think that if this can be disseminated to a wider audience, the folks who would be able to benefit, I think, more from it would mainly be the SMEs. However, I think multinationals can also, given that their supply chains are typically more complex as they involve more countries and also more invoicing parties globally. I think one of the challenges for many multinationals is always the use of third-party locations as regional warehouses to consolidate goods. And I think a problem that has always been there, even under the existing FTAs, is that when goods are consolidated in one jurisdiction, and you have goods coming in from the same jurisdiction that's going back to the same jurisdiction, that has always been an issue, which I think in RCEP, perhaps could still be an issue. So I'm not sure if that has answered your question.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Mengyu. And let me now turn to Professor Tam. I would like to ask a question about the utilization rates, because it featured quite a lot in your presentation. So you're starting with saying like utilization are quite low in FTAs, and also because raising the highlighting the difficulties for MSMEs to use those agreements. My question is, in our report, we also do note that utilization rates are low, and but we recommend to use utilization rates as monitoring and evaluation tool for FTAs, because they can be also used to advocate reforms, and also at the sectoral levels could help, better understand which rule needs to be adjusted. Now, you mentioned that they are not public, so we cannot really consider them as public goods. So my question isn't it the time to, release those utilization rates and have some sort of a, common database and some broad region-wide analysis on those utilization to foster the use of trade agreements in the region?
I think ADB can do a lot of work in this area. First, actually, how do you measure the utilization rate? And then, of course, the ministries which have the raw data need to share the data so that it can be compared across the region and analyzed, because the problem is that the data is not available. And then where it is available, there's no capacity to analyze it, because we are not just looking at the utilization rate. What we want to understand is actually a little bit of the companies that are able to use it, so that we can understand, why is it they are able to use it. I mean, typically, for example, JICA does this annual survey of Japanese companies and looks at whether they're using it, why they're not using it, because there are a lot of good reasons why they're not using it, apart from the high compliance costs, you see. So if the matter is not studied properly and analyzed properly, then we are circling around the same problem, right? So I do agree that there's a lot of work to be done there. And if it can be intergovernmental, it's very good, because then you have a common measure, you look for data that is somewhat harmonized, and then you have a better understanding as to why perhaps some countries are able to use it more effectively, or some countries, why is it some countries cannot use it? After all, in the end, why do we go into all this bother about negotiating 10-year agreements, isn't it? If it's not going to be useful for anyone except the trade negotiators.
Thank you so much, Professor Tan. Maybe we can return to Jamie to answer that question. The last question you raised, but there is another question for Jamie in the chat box, and it relates to let me see, the grace period. Sorry, right? Yeah, the grace period. Let me see. Sorry, I'm just for domestic preparation. So I'm not sure if you could see the question. Let me read it. Under RCEP certification of origin, New Zealand, together with ASEAN and Australia, requested for 7 years of grace period domestic preparation. Would you be able to clarify what specifically this period would be used for in the case of New Zealand?
How much can I say here? Let me think. How can I answer this question? Let's put it this way. New Zealand was a strong proponent of the Declaration of Origin provision to be included, and our position was for it to be included as soon as possible for as many people as possible, but recognizing the diverse nature, I'll go back to my theme, of our partners, the negotiated outcome was to have the phased period. New Zealand actually did not seek an extended period, and we will be looking to implement the Declaration of Origin provisions this year. Unfortunately, when entry into force came in for New Zealand, the December-January period is our traditional summer holiday time. And after people had been working on this for a period of time, they had some time off, and we're now undertaking that work. But certainly New Zealand Customs plan is to be both, is to be accepting declarations of origin immediately, as soon as possible from people, and I think we are now, and to be issuing them to approved exporters as soon as possible. So as I say, we were a strong advocate of this approach. We continue to be a strong advocate of this approach, and we hope others take up that mantle as soon as possible as well. One issue, if I can just comment on the PSRs that were developed, because unfortunately for my sins, I was also led the PSR negotiations for New Zealand. It was a fun-filled 8 years, let me tell you. And the default became from ASEAN the RVC40 or CTH. And the RVC40 was a measure that was comfortable with by all parties and accepted by all parties, and had been used by almost all parties in the past. And so that became a default landing zone. I think there are a few lines where we have a higher RVC level, but rather than having to negotiate those on a good by good basis, where for a good in chapter, you know, a chemical it may be 22%, whereas for a goods in the cars it may be 28%, it just became easier once again to use the default measure of RVC40 as a way to take the negotiations, well, that still lasted 8+ years, from lasting maybe 30 or 40 years.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Yes, and indeed, the analysis of our product-specific rules of origin. Yes, we can also see the influence of these ASEAN general rules in the report that we launched last Friday. That is also in the chat box. So I think for me, it's time to close. But before closing, I would like to give the floor to each panelist and presenters, just for a final word, like less than a minute, like 30 seconds final words on maybe, if you can, on forward-looking approach, because we have heard a lot about the challenges and difficulties, and I would like to try to finish on a positive note, if possible. So let me start with Kit. Do you want to start?
Thank you, I think. I think just in these sort of discussions, although everything needs to be discussed, the primacy goes to the big ticket items, market access, rules of origin and that. But those certification procedures, you can get your rules of origin right. You can have all the market access you want, but you ain't going to get either if you can't get your goods across the border. And they seem to get forgotten in the wash, and they are vitally important. Picking up on Mrs. Tam's utilization rate, the main reason business don't utilize FTAs is because it's too hard. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A clear message on revising the certification, because this is the clear obstacle to trade. Now, Professor Tam, would you like to give a final word?
I think SMEs have to be motivated. That a lot of, I mean, we keep saying, you know, SMEs need to learn, but how do we motivate them to want to reach out and expand their market reach? So maybe we have to think a bit beyond just looking at free trade agreements.
Thank you so much. This is noted. So it's not only about using or challenges, but it's also incentives and giving them the opportunity, the willingness to explore new destinations. Now, let me ask Stefano, do you have a final word?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, that the path ahead of us, in terms of recommendation emerging from this exchange of discussion between all of us is quite clear. There is an effort, should be done to revisit the rules, with a trade facilitating spirit. I think that we are on a common understanding that on proof of origin, the things has to be facilitated, and self-declaration, imported declaration is the best way forward. On the product-specific rules of origin, Well, if we see the CTH and RVC 40 is applied throughout the regions, well, I mean, let's move ahead with that and trying, I mean, to converge on rather than having different rules of origin across the various agreements, which creates another layer of difficulties. And on tariffs, I mean, if we want to make RCEP more interesting to use, obviously there is a case for further liberalization on tariff. And utilization rates, I think the WTO recently has agreed on how to measure utilization rates. They have established notification procedures. Something similar could be done also in RCEP to monitor the effective use of RCEP by firms. And this should be done not only by firm, but it should be discussed at the intergovernmental level. I mean, to monitor the effective use of RCEP. I think, I mean, the path ahead of us is quite clear if the government are listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Mengyu?
I will just say, big note of thanks, to all of the negotiators, who have worked the 8 years to get us the agreement that we have today. On a daily basis, on almost daily basis, we work, on FTAs together with clients, and we support them in utilizing these FTAs. I think, in this current trade climate, trade is good. And firms are always and continuously looking for ways to save duties and also to enter into new markets. We are very happy to be able to support clients and companies do that. A big thanks to all of the negotiators, the trade ministries and bodies like ADB. For making free trade possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mengyu. And so the final word for Jamie.
Oh, the final word, crikey, no pressure. Two things very quickly. One, RCEP is not a final product, it's a work in progress. And there is some of the points that have been raised today by the panelists are very relevant points that we can build into that work that is still being undertaken. I'm not sure if we can do everything to make Kit happy, but we can certainly progress things. And the second is, I think forums, as was pointed out by Mengyu, forums such as this that spread the word about RCEP, that give it all the perspectives, will be valuable in increasing its utilization. So it is a work in progress, but it's a pretty good starting point.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for finishing on this positive note. I think this is the end of this session. I really thank you, all the panelists, the speakers, the participants for the insightful questions. And I'm not sure if there is a photo session or not, because I have this on my schedule. But if I don't hear anything.
Yes, we do, Pamela.
There is? You already took the photo, or we are taking one now?
So panelists, please give us your best smile. Leslie, on your cue, thank you.
Okay, taking a photo in 3, 2, 1, smile. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you. So we will resume, at what's the time? In 5 minutes, I think. Let me see. At 3:15 Manila time for the session on trading services and investment. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Pamela. Cheers all. Cheers, Jamie.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you. Bye.